The Spill, a cooperative and solo-friendly game in which the player or players will control a team of emergency specialists that are trying to deal with the fact that this offshore rig that we see here is spilling oil all around, and so their job will be to try to contain the disaster as oil represented by black dice will spread from the center of the board. And also, as the players are doing so, they're trying to protect these animals here that are represented by these tokens. And here you see a general view of the boards with the animal tokens that need to be placed in that specific configuration there at the beginning of the game. We have a display here, which is used for various functions, and we'll see later what those are. But first, we want to take a look at our respondent, our heroes, our characters. You will always have 4 characters in play regardless of the number of players, and I play the game solo, and so I simply control all 4 characters. All you need to do is a token to remind you of who the actual character is. Cthulhu token not included with the set sold separately. So, and once you know who the active player is, then you control the character, take their turn, resolve the bad stuff that happens on the board, go to the next character, and so on and so forth. Now, the game is reminiscent of Pandemic on many levels, and partially also the theme, the idea that there's something bad on the board that will spread, and you're trying to control it, remove the bad tokens from the board before they cause dangerous concentrations. Again, in particular here, you're going to have these dice. So first, the oil rig is this cool dice tower here. You see stickers here. There were supposed to be stickers also that the game comes with, but they're simply too large. They just don't fit on the different layers of the tower. The game starts again with those animal tokens placed there and with 8 oil dice dumped in the tower. And they may fall in one of 4 quadrants. And then you will simply, each quadrant is also divided into multiple sectors, each sector labeled using a number. So for example, this die number 1 here fell in this quadrant and goes in sector number 1. You place them first in a sector, in the sector is closest to the rig, if that is available, or suppose that this was a 5. If that is already taken, then you put in next in the other one, moving outward. Now, during setup, usually you cannot place a die, an oil die, in an area containing an animal, but I'm just showing how the game works. That in general, if a die is placed in an area that contains a healthy animal, you flip the animal to the contaminated side. Poor turtle. And so you will place again these dice in the different sectors as a way of starting the game. And yes, if you're playing solo, you have to reach behind that tower a little bit, but it's not too bad, especially for, you know, me, since I have long arms. I recently played Return to Dark Tower solo, and that tower is a lot more imposing, so reaching behind was a lot more of a problem. So that's the general idea. Then each turn, new dice will be added. Most of them are oil dice that are black. Some are blue dice that represent game effects, usually negative. They're still dropped in to see which effect they represent, because those weather dice will have different effects. But once you see what effect that is, then you resolve that effect, and that is removed from the game. Now, we're talking about those characters. Remember, our heroes. Each comes with a set of tokens such as that one. And when a weather effect is rolled, you flip the corresponding token. Suppose that, for example, that effect was rolled on the weather die, then everybody flips that one face up, indicating that on the next turn, rescuing an animal will cost an extra action point. We'll see what that means. And at the end of my turn, I flip that face down. So when the weather effect is rolled, everybody flips his face up, and then they remove that at the end of their turn. And as you can imagine, these characters each have a unique ability or a different cost for doing different things. So we have dice that allows come out of that rig, and I'm gonna dump a couple of other ones just for the fun of it, because hey, dumping dice in a dice tower. Who doesn't love that? Come on, let's admit it. So, oh, for example, this is getting particularly interesting and bad because I got 3 dice there, and that causes a spill out. And too many spillouts on the board is one of the ways in which you lose the game. Again, also that animal there is contaminated. When an animal is contaminated by a die, unless the animal is rescued that very turn, so that turns, well, that player who is activated, unless that player rescues that, all contaminated animals are removed from the board at the end of the turn, if they are still with oil dice, and they're placed in sick bay. So, I think now you have enough information to understand how you win and you lose the game. You lose the game if there ever are 6 spillout tokens on the board. You lose the game if 3 of a kind of animals, say 3 horses, have been placed to sickbay. Or if a full set of animals have been placed to sickbay, and there are 6 different animals, so 1 per. Having spillouts on the board is also bad because, similar to outbreaks in pandemic, they accelerate the rate of the bad stuff being placed on the board. Every time there's a spillout, you move that token by 1 space. At the beginning of the game, 3 more dice are added at the end of each turn, and it becomes 4, and so on and so forth. And this also, you can set up the difficulty to standard, challenge, and ultimate, which of course, ultimate accelerates the rate at which dice are dumped a lot faster. To win the game, you may survive until the end of the bag, basically until all dice have been placed from the bag, and that's very hard. A more reasonable, more likely way is to complete the win conditions on your card. And these cards have dots indicating how easy they are. 1 is the easiest, 2 is intermediate, 3 is like, oh my gosh. And you choose or draw 1 randomly at the beginning of the game, and so if you meet all of your win conditions, then you win the game. So those are the main parameters for winning or losing the game. Now, when it is your turn, you will take 4 actions, so at least you have 4 action points to spend. Again, clearly very reminiscent of pandemic, of course. And you can take your actions in any order that you want, and you can take your actions multiple times if allowed by resources. Each player, again remember, represented by this card, is connected to a ship that moves on the outer ridge of the board and performs actions. Usually you can all interact with things that are in the same sector that your ship is facing. So right now that ship of the hazmat specialists could only interact with those elements, and there are of course abilities that let you break that rule. Action point. For 1 action point, you can move 1 or 2 spaces in either direction. For an action point, you can rescue an animal, again in the sector next to you. Then you take it and you place it on that display there of the rescue marine life. We'll see what that does. For 2 action points, you can rescue a contaminated animal, so it's a little more expensive. And you need to keep the contaminated side up if you rescue them when you place them in the rescue display, because some victory conditions require that you rescue contaminated animals. It is also possible, if the contaminated animal is together with an oil dye, you cannot rescue the animal until you remove the dye in some way. And there are 2 main ways. One is for single action points, you push the oil back, which means you remove it from the space, but it goes back in the bag. The other way, super expensive unless you're the hazmat specialist, is you spend 2 action points to remove a dye, and it doesn't go back to the bag, it goes to the display in that removed oil section. So these two sections are important because they may be connected to victory conditions. They're also important because you may see those orange symbols there. When you rescue a full set of animals once per, you get an orange cube. When you complete a column of remove oil dice, you also get an orange cube. And those are, hey, who doesn't like a good wooden cube? But that's not the only reason to collect them. At the beginning of the game, you will draw cards on this deck, and you will form a line under the main display in the resource area, just like you see there. When you collect an orange cube, you can place it on one of those slots there, and basically that is charging the ability of the card, and some effects require more charges. So you can also choose to spend a card when it has been charged to resolve the effect instantly, and there are just different things that can happen there. So your main actions, so back to the board, your main actions will be to move 1 or 2 sectors, rescue an animal for 1 point, rescue a contaminated animal for more points, remove a die and put it back in the bag, or a lot more expensive, remove a die from the game, place it on the display that I showed you. An interesting idea is that, you know, those games like, you know, Pandemic, you're like, dang, I'm 1 action short for doing like a nice combo. I wish there was a way to get an extra point even at a cost. This game allows you to do so. I like the flexibility. So during your turn, you can spend more than your 4 default points. You can spend an extra action or 2 at the cost of 1 or 2 dice respectively that are placed on the extra action pool space of the display. All that means is the next player, on top of the regular number of dice that they need to dump on the board, they will get 1 extra die if you spend an extra action, 2 extra dice if you spend 2 extra actions. So I like that the team can choose to go all in 1 turn at the risk, at the certainty actually, of a bigger wave of dice coming out of the rig next time. So again, this is the general idea. Take turn after turn, dumping more cubes on the board, taking your 4 or 5 or 6 actions, containing the disaster, rescuing animals, trying to meet your victory conditions before any of the lose conditions apply. The game has good production, definitely with a strong table presence thanks to that dice tower in the middle. And from time to time, maybe 2 dice get stuck in the funnel, but I'll just shake it a little bit. The art is really, really nice. Maybe one thing I would like, if the box was a little bit thicker, then you'll be able to store the dice tower without taking it apart every time, laying it down. But that's a little thing. If there are components that require assembly, I prefer when there's an option to store them assembled already. But that's just a small, teeny, tiny detail. So, as for gameplay, the game clearly shows its lineage from Pandemic. And so a comparison really is in order. It's pretty obvious that the games share a lot of things. It also shows, as it's not just a derivative, but it really has this second generation feel to it. Meaning that time and time again, when earlier ideas from the early 2000s are remade in recent times, you can see a trend which usually is of giving us extra complexity, extra effects, more variety, more things to do. Which makes sense. Our hobby trains its own practitioners, so we're becoming used to playing games with more rules and more unique effects just because previous games with fewer of those trained us to do so. So again, if you like Pandemic, I think you will enjoy this one, and vice versa. But I don't know why you wouldn't like Pandemic, so I don't think how you would hate this game if you like modern gaming, because all the ideas that are strong in Pandemic are presented here in a variant. 4 action points, all the advantages of Pandemic, of great flexibility there. Actually, you have more flexibility here because, yes, you have those moments in those turns where you have absolutely nothing to do in Pandemic with your last action, but now you can do something with that. One thing that is different and significantly so, and may turn off some players, is that there is more randomness here. In Pandemic, when you know that certain cities are being hit by disease, you know that they'll hit again. So you can really concentrate your efforts. You can take that into account. The deck has a memory, and the players can take that into account. Here, the dumping of the dice, which is super fun. I'm just a sucker for a good dice tower. What can I tell you? The tumbling down of the dice, the noise, the vibrations. It just I like it. But from the point of view of gameplay, it means that the system has no memory. And yes, a game may end up being a lot easier or a lot harder because certain numbers keep hitting the same quadrant, or they just happen to spread out in a way that they're very manageable. There is that. There is definitely a larger element of randomness in that sense, which means that the game, from that point of view of managing bad stuff on the board, feels a lot more tactical. It's about responding to the next tumbling of the dice or two, as opposed to, well, I kind of know exactly what's in there because I remember what was there before, and I know what has come out of the deck yet, so I a good sense of like Kairos next. You cannot do that, for good or for bad. Again, so that means that the level of challenge may change during the game. And sometimes also, it's a great fight there, and then you realize that the challenge sort of like, plateaus a little bit. And sometimes the end of the game may feel a bit anticlimactic and also a bit anti-thematic, because basically it gets to a point where to complete my 3 scripted victory conditions, I need to collect 2 more dice. So sorry, animals, you're not interesting to me anymore. I collected 3 sets, so bye-bye. So definitely the last objective will feel a little bit anticlimactic and anti-thematic because you don't care about anything else at that point. In Pandemic, it's like, well, the last objective is I'm still curing a disease. That matters. So again, the similarities with Pandemic and the differences are there. The game does feel, to a large extent as a Pandemic variant in terms of gameplay. The topic may be more interesting to people, especially because Pandemic may still feel a little like too soon these days in 2022. So it's up to you if the theme is more appealing to you, and maybe some people feel that they don't need both in the collection, again, because there are convergences in the gameplay that simply you can't ignore. But personally, I'm happy to have both because I like the theme of the spell, I like the art, I like a good dice tower, and I like the different implementations and the different elements of gameplay that have been added here.